Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the RWA Coffee and Conversation today with Felicia Marcus. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to go through some housekeeping today before we get on with the coffee and conversation. For everyone, the webinar is being recorded. There'll be a link that will be available after the webinar for those who want to listen to it later on. Please feel free to submit questions as we are using the Q&A button on your screen. The live transcript is available by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Again, thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to introduce Mayor Bruce Houdeshelt from the city of Roseville. For more than a quarter century, 25 years, both professionally and part of his public service, water resource management has been central to the work of Mayor Bruce Houdeshelt. Whether it is in serving on a business caucus of the landmark Sacramento Regional Water Forum process, while he worked for the local BIA, or in his current role as the Director of Water Quality for the Northern California Water Association, Mayor Houdeshelt understands the multiple benefits water provides to our region, the ecosystem, and agriculture. He began his public service as commissioner on the Roseville Public Utilities Commission from 2010 to 2012, and has been the Roseville City Council representative to the Sites Authority Board, the Placer County Water Agency, Roseville Water Committee, and the Regional Water Authority. Thank you, Bruce, for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jim. And, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to introduce our Felicia Marcus as part of this webinar. Felicia has held a lot of positions. She likes to describe herself sort of as the Forrest Gump of the environmental world. But I think especially given the atmospheric rivers that have rolled through here and the operational challenges we've had and experience we had, I think one of her outstanding qualities is that she led the Public Works Department in Los Angeles for a while. Felicia, as you know, was the former chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. That's where I where I work at Northern California Water Association, interacted with her on a regular basis. She was also the regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency in the Clinton administration, and was the Western Director for the Natural Resources Defense Council. Prior to that, she worked for the Trust for Public Land. It really is the Forrest Gump, aren't you, of the environmental world, conservation world. So, and so she now works for she is now the William C. Landreth Visiting Fellow at Stanford University's Water in the West program. And it is a pleasure to introduce her. Thank you, Felicia, for being here today.
Thank you. It's a thrill to be here. And very nice to see you.
Felicia, thank you very much for joining us today and having this conversation. We have a number of questions we'd like to ask you, but I also, I know that you're very proud of serving with on the LA board at one point for a local agency. And I really appreciate you doing that and your experience that you brought as the chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. You were always very accessible to me. You may recall years ago, we were working on something called the trash policy. And I really appreciate that local experience that you had. And you were really helpful mediating the interest between the State Water Board staff and at the time, the city of Sacramento and a number of other agencies. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Pleasure.
So I was hoping that you might want to tell us what you're working on these days, and if you have any thoughts that you want to start right off the bat sharing with this audience.
Well, I sort of start by saying I'm happy to see. I looked at the list, and it's nice that so many folks I haven't seen in a while are here, and that so many new people are here. So that's always pretty exciting and fun. And I'm just sorry I can't be there in person today. I have not spent much time in Sacramento. I'll be up there a few times in the coming weeks, but I just think this is a pivotal time in California water. I mean, kind of how I feel about it depends on how much sleep I've gotten the night before a lot of the time, but you can see signs, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit, of some pretty interesting movement and continuing forward movement towards doing some of the things we have to do to deal with the nightmare of climate change that's coming at us, that's going to make these extremes more extreme, and particularly the more frequent and drier dries punctuated by years like this one. And we'll have to just hope that this one wasn't just a early season bonanza, but that we get a few more of these trains, albeit at a metered out level in the course of the season. But I think on the Colorado and in the Sierra system, we've been doing incremental things for a long time and putting off kind of the day of reckoning of making some more dramatic changes. And I'm seeing some people ready to do some of that. We'll see. Some days I feel like it's hopeless, but I do gain inspiration from the people who have managed to create unlikely alliances for agriculture, urban use, and the ecosystem like the Sacramento area, starting with the Water Forum, which I always cite to when I'm talking to people around the country, but also things like SAPA, the Santa Ana Water Project Authority down south, and any number. I'm seeing more and more of those, just as I'm also seeing conflict. So it's an exciting time, and it's kind of a cool time to be in a more observer status, because it gives me the luxury of being able to actually think about things and talk to people and learn about areas that I haven't had time to. So it's been kind of great.
Well,
you want me to talk about Stanford at all? A little
yes,
bit?
please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm doing a few things. I won't go through everything I'm doing because this is sort of the portfolio phase, I feel, of my life, where I get to do all the things I didn't have time to do when I was at the water board, because that's such an all-consuming task. So at Stanford, I'm a visiting fellow, and kind of it's set up as a practitioner in residence. So the whole idea is you're bringing somebody into the academy who actually has been a part of making public policy, as opposed to theorizing about it or just looking at the data that they can get. So it's been fun. So I teach some classes. I lecture in other people's classes a lot. I do other lectures, and I mentor and counsel a lot of students and actually help professors with some of their projects as well. So it's that part of it's really fun. And then I've been there longer than the fellowship has been before, because some foundations came in and asked me to do some projects. So I've been doing a lot on nature-based solutions, projects on the intersection of water and land use in state policy. There aren't as many of them as you would think across the West. Underutilized tools to protect in-stream flows, a host of that, and a fair amount of work outside of Stanford for US EPA on how to get people to collaborate better, particularly in the recycled water world. And I went on the National Water Reuse Board, and I went on an ag board in Nebraska, and I've spent a lot of time on climate adaptation and water in the international arena. That was something, that and recycling and getting back to LA and writing about LA were two things that I really missed doing when I was at the water board. So it's been a lot of fun. Let's just say that.
So since we started off, you covered a couple topics that I'd like to dig a little deeper on, but let's start off with the big question. What will it take for California to adapt to climate change, in your opinion?
Well, some people have heard me say this, belt suspenders, flying monkeys, all of the above. I think we spent decades in California with everybody arguing about what the one thing was. And if people didn't agree with their one thing, they wrote all those people off. And the only time we've made progress is when we recognize that we need to do a lot of things, and that it's not one or the other. It's not a zero-sum game. And so I think that's particularly important in California, because we're not going to store our way out of it. We're not going to conserve our way out of it. No one thing is going to meet the challenge that we're facing, because what climate change is going to bring, with just a few degrees temperature rise where we lose our snowpack, is a nightmare scenario for a system that is based on that in largest part as our main source of storage. And we could never build enough storage to make up for that. And so we have to do a lot of other things. So we have to figure out how to conserve first and foremost, which is the cheapest, smartest, and fastest way to go. And I know there are a lot of great efficiency experts on this call who can help people get there. We got to recycle. We've got to capture stormwater. We've got to get groundwater in the ground faster, the way we are with managed aquifer recharge. I mean, some places you can do it, like in the San Gabriel Valley, where they've been capturing 90% of what runs off the mountains for years. Why? Because they have sandy soils and gravel, which is also why they're a major Superfund site, because everything can get into the ground faster, whereas most of California is this very mixed geology. Sometimes you got clay, but it's all fractured. And so it's very complicated. And so figuring out where the best places are to get water in fastest is a tough job because you can't see it. And so it's really exciting work going on with DWR doing flyovers of the valley to look for paleo valleys, but also just to look for where is the perfect place where you can get it in the soil and then figure out where it's going to go. Rosemary Knight at Stanford has been a leader in that, but others at UC Davis, Helen Dahlke and others, there's some really great people trying to help. Tom Harder, especially with both that and the water quality aspect of it. A lot of people out there inspiringly in the GSA is trying to figure out how to be creative in getting water in faster. I also think we need to get much better at integrating water and climate objectives because they're not all separated. And we've got to look at the entire landscape and watershed as a whole. I mean, the MBS paper I worked on, I had no pre-intention of what the answer was going to be. I was just asked to look at synergies between climate policy in the Western states, particularly the Colorado Basin in particular, and multi-benefit solutions, nature-based solutions that yielded water benefits. And with no answer in mind, but a hope, I think, that meadows and grazing would be a big winner there because there's so many high mountain meadows and grazing in the Colorado Basin, way more than ours are postage stamps compared to what they have in scale. But what I found in looking at it was that forests were the biggest bet if you wanted to get water benefits. And there's some amazing, we can talk about if you want, some amazing stuff happening in California in particular, which is, I think, why they asked me to write the paper in general, where you've got things like the North Yuba Forest Partnership, what Yuba Water Agency is a key leader in, but a bunch of agencies and a lot of nonprofits and the tribe doing some amazing headwaters work that's going to yield some water benefits that are harder to quantify in $1 per acre foot, the same way it's hard to quantify forest work in $1 per ton of carbon saved. But if you look at these things from a multi-benefit perspective, forests are kind of a dead bang winner because you've got the giant multi-benefits of protecting life and limb, which is compelling in a policy sense, but also preventing conflagrations of this incredible overgrowth of forests that we've allowed to happen, both through forest practices, but also through a well-intentioned but kind of misguided Smokey Bear stifle every fire, where now we've got this fuel load that is just a tinderbox that creates these giant fires that kill the big trees that we need for sequestration, a lot of other things, and end up putting a plume of carbon out there that's more than fossil fuels now internationally. So there's just all kinds of movement and reasons to do it, but you end up with all kinds of water benefits, and particularly some timing benefits, as you can get more snow off the crown and onto the ground in a place where we might have a chance of saving it a little bit longer. And if you add meadow restoration, you can actually get amazing water features and the like that create natural fire breaks and habitat, and again substitute for that timing loss that we're going to have with losing snowpack. So there's just there's a ton of stuff I could talk about, but I really think this belt suspenders, flying monkeys, all of the above is really important. And that's why in the Brown administration we did the Water Action Plan, the Newsom administration did the Resilience Plan, which was the logical next step, and then now has it focused into a water supply strategy. But all of it is more all of the above. And we are seeing, and we can talk about this, more parts of the state picking up recycling and stormwater capture big time in urban areas, and of course the managed aquifer recharge in the Central Valley in particular. And then if you add to that the other NBS work that I want to do next, which is really focusing on floodplain restoration, where you can really get some bang for the buck. I think it's really pretty exciting what we could do, but we got to get over ourselves and thinking there's one thing, and the combat aspect of the dialogue around water, and the naivete of thinking that a single project is going to change the world. All of them are important in one way or the other, and some are better than others, but the biggest bang is going to be groundwater storage, because our overdrafted groundwater basins are the only thing that can approximate in size the snowpack we're going to lose in short order. And every year it seems like shorter order than we thought the year before.
Indeed. So you talked about the Western states. This is something that's on people's mind is the Colorado River.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see California having to give up more Colorado River water in the future?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, there's no doubt about it. How it's going to happen is an interesting question, but if the water's not there, the water's not there. And, the biggest single chunk of water in the Colorado goes to California, largely because Imperial Irrigation District is the largest and most senior water rights holder on the Colorado River. But the question is how it's going to be split, really, between IID, Met, and Coachella. Palo Verde is in there too. They're kind of small, and there are a few others, I think, some of the tribes as well. But there have been ongoing conversations about how to do that. I think people recognize, I'm going to paraphrase or borrow from a different adage to create a new adage, but it's like when people have senior water rights, they argue senior water rights, and when people have equity, they argue equity. And I think what we'll see is that they have to come up with a solution that marries the two of them in some way at the moment. But there's no way California is going to get all their water and we're going to let Arizona go down the tubes. Just not going to happen at the blunt scale that water rights would suggest. So we're going to see an interesting year. And the end of this month, the 7 states are supposed to submit a plan to the Department of Interior about how they want to allocate the 2 to 4 million that we're going to need to cut, just because it's not there and the system's about to crash, with massive consequences on energy and water for millions of people. So it'll be interesting to see if people can rise to that occasion, or if the Interior Department's going to have to be the 800-pound gorilla in not just a threatening way, but in an action way, to propose a plan that'll get us where we need to go to protect the system. It's of course possible they'll put something out and then a deal will be made. That's not uncommon, but we've never been at this point in history. The one thing I'd say is that the California agencies tried, and they put 400,000 acre feet on the table. And it was a combination of things, obviously wanting to be paid for it. And there is $4 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act to help make this happen. But a lot in it about getting rid of lawns and upping recycling. So there's some permanent things that could be done and funded that would lessen the pain. And we'll see how much the feds will pay water users for temporarily or more permanently giving up some of their water. So it's incredibly interesting. I'm spending a lot of time following it, and later in the year, I want to spend a lot more time on it. But we're going to have to, and it has an impact on everything else in California water, because Southern California is half of the population of California. So it's kind of it's a big deal. But I will say that folks are on speed in Southern California to try and adapt and adjust to both the Colorado and the Sierra shortages to come. And the largest recycled water projects in the world, and massive stormwater capture program at $300 million a year to do multi-benefit capture, flood control, green space, water quality projects. You're going to see the face of LA County transform in the next decade in a really good way, at the same time as underground, the whole area is going to be transformed from these massive recycling programs. Very exciting stuff.
Wow. I'm going to remind the audience members to submit your questions. We have a couple in the queue, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. Actually, I'm going to start with one. When will the 7 states plan be released? I don't know if you have any insight on that, Felicia.
Well, I don't know. It's due January 31st. So I think people are expecting something. I mean, there have been comments on a draft supplemental EIS that I think it's a supplement. It might be a regular EIS that the Bureau of Reclamation put out, and it, in terms of some ideas for what they might be doing. And I've tried to read through some of them, but they're a little bit more on what you shouldn't do than what you should do. So it'll be, which is fair. But it'll be interesting to see if a plan comes together. It may well be that people come together with parts of a plan that doesn't quite get there, but it still moves the ball forward. These things can happen, in increments. It's hard to go from 0 to 60 on such a big change. And, as nobody wants to give their water away. And it's naive to think that people will give their water away. So you have to structure a dynamic in which people don't feel like they're being chumps or being taken advantage of, and have the political cover to make some of these hard decisions. And usually that takes a court, or it takes an 800-pound gorilla like the state or the federal government. That's a big part of the job. I mean, I've been the 800-pound gorilla at the state and federal level, even though I'm a friendly one. But somebody's got to be out there to make the hard call. And then you can say, now, if you give me something better, I'll take it. But it's naive to expect people to just come give it to you, whether it's environmental community or the water users. But some people want to stay in that space. And the problem is that space is a space where you don't make progress.
Right. Felicia, you elaborated, or you talked a little bit about this, but we do have a question from Molly Colton of the Sierra Club. And her question is this: given the recent atmospheric river and bomb cyclone storm events, how can the state utilize excess runoff and precipitation from these storms to help manage and prepare for extreme drought events during dry periods? You talked a little bit about that, but I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that.
Oh, I definitely do. I mean, that's one of my favorite topics. I mean, it's a great question. I think the best thing we can do is do what we need to do to get as much of it in the ground as we can. As I said, this technical scientific work of flying the helicopter flyovers, the putting sensors behind tractors and actually mapping what we're dealing with is really important, because we have to be more precise as opposed to it just being incidental flood flow. We need to direct water to the places where it's going to get in the ground faster. And there's amazing stuff happening all across the Central Valley, not everywhere, but an awful lot of places. And Sarge Green knows all of them at Fresno State. We did a panel at the International Society for Managed Aquifer Recharge with examples of a lot of the really interesting things happening in California. And the beauty of it is people are actually doing it in many cases in the same places where that recharge yields an environmental benefit on the ground. So it's exciting. It's also a piece of hopefully the land repurposing funding that the Newsom administration got and wants more of to help people with the Sigma transition. But the biggest bang for the buck is in setting back massive floodplains. So more YOLO bypass type projects. I mean, that one is saving Sacramento, but it's also getting water into the ground and creating environmental benefits. So we need to do that in as many places as we can. The Dos Rios project that has been heralded and took a good 10 years, if not more, to do is another one at the confluence of the Tuolumne and the San Joaquin that River Partners honchoed, and a lot of people had a part in. It's just become a new state park, and it's going to yield flood control benefits for cities further down on the San Joaquin. It gives them, they can measure how much more time they're going to have to evacuate in the case of a massive flood or dam break, which is kind of exciting, that you can actually figure this stuff out. But we're going to need to do a lot more of that multi-purposing of land. And the Central Valley Flood Board did a plan a few years ago that was actually really good and endorsed all of this. We've got to put money into that, and we've got to really implement it as best we can, because it's our best hope. And that's what's happening in other countries. And it's really the way to go. But there's a lot. We also need dispersed off-stream storage of all kinds of different sizes. I think it's not just relying on these mega charismatic projects, but local projects. I mean, I think Diamond Valley that Metropolitan did offstream, 800,000 acre foot reservoir, which has actually saved Southern California's butt in the last 2 droughts for a number of years. Really helpful, where you can put water when you have it, so that you can use it when you don't. The key is not to waste it when you have it on, making your lawns emerald green in the middle of the summer. So we have a long way to go on how we use it. Los Vaqueros, classic example of one that has done a good job of working with stakeholders, and was built and was raised, and is probably going to be one of the first ones to be raised again, because they do their homework and do such a good job of it. Raising San Luis, I think, is something that's now on deck with people. I don't know what took so long for that one. So we've got to do that. Doesn't mean every place that everyone can imagine a dam is the right place for it, but
Right.
belt suspenders, flying monkeys. I'm just saying.
There we go. It's a reoccurring theme to get us ready for climate change. We have a few more questions in the question box, and I'm gonna here's one. Can you comment on state financing? Should the state do a water ballot measure? What size should it be, and what are the components?
Well, that's actually a good question. I don't know. I can't say off the bat. I have a bias here in that I do think, and this may be explosive, but I think we have to come up with a funding mechanism that's just not bond to bond. I know people hate the idea of a public goods charge, but it works in energy and air. In some ways, why the fees for air permits are still much cheaper than water permits, because water is all based on fee base. And we just don't have the money to do the head of the occur things and be able to plan for it. That said, I think bonds are important. It was nice that we had this bonanza of money in the budget the last couple of years. I would have liked more of it to go into recycling and stormwater capture than did, but grateful for everything that did. Grateful for the people who passed Prop 1 and the subsequent, I think it was 5, all great. So I think, but I think we ought to deep dig and go much bigger than conventional wisdom suggests. I mean, I've been through these bond measures, more than ones in the 90s and the early 2000s with the consultants. And, there's always a balance point about how much the voters will bear. So if you talk about the need is we need $20 billion to build out. If we had that to give out, we'd be able to build out, even if we had 10, we'd be able to do a lot more build out of recycling faster. We'd be able to do more stormwater capture projects. We'd be able to be even faster in making sure that the human right to water is met in our small communities. There's a lot we could do, but you've got to be realistic and look at the polling and see what the voters will support. And you have to make a really good case for it. And what should be in it, as I think the all of the above is always a good way to go. And as horrible as it is, I have to close that blind because I'm trying to get out of the way of it. And it's
Please,
difficult.
yes.
It'll take me 1 second, and my headset, because nobody's here anymore.
All right. Well, as much as we appreciate the rain, it's always good to get a little bit of sunshine, and hopefully it helps with the vitamin D.
Yeah.
We have a few questions coming in, and we might not get to all of them today, but they're great questions. There seems to be a lot of questions coming in relating to recharge, and we're gonna get to a couple of those in just a second.
Great.
Here's one from Nick Teague. How do smaller water agencies get these types of projects, stormwater capture, MAR or flood MAR, off the ground? Are there groups outside the assistance offered by the state that can help? And I'm gonna put a pitch in for my region, the Regional Water Authority, that is trying to do that type of thing, and have a number of water agencies work together collectively for what's called the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. But Felicia, I don't know if you want to add anything to that question.
Well, I think your answer is a good one. I think the collective engagement allows you to get an economy of scale and the ability at scale to look at the best projects, as opposed to having a myriad of one-offs. I got mine. Integrating across agencies in a collective is a way to get economy of scale, but also to use each other's resources to be able to hire the technical and, in some cases, planning and policy consultants you need to make these projects work. And so that's partially why I'm a fan of the the Waterfront Regional Water Authority, why I'm a fan of the Santa Ana watershed. I think it's planning, or I think it's Project Authority, which is, one of the best ones in the country, let alone the state. Books have been written about it. But that, came on after 30 years of litigation over water rights, but they're doing a lot of work on recycle water projects and capture and desalting and the different things that they need to do as a watershed, which goes all the way from the headwaters of the Santa Ana through Orange County. I mean, it's an amazing collaborative, just as the Regional Water Authority is. And so that's, I think, where you get that economy of scale rather than one-offs. Because it's always hard, even, if you know what you want to do, to get the planning documents and the funding documents through. And, the state board has a lot of technical assistance for small disadvantaged communities, understandably. And we were given money to be able to do that. And we also allocated money that we could legally allocate from the bond funds and from other funds in order to be able to do that. That's part of it. Part of why the advocates in the disadvantaged community or the underserved community wanted the drinking water program moved to us, is because we were so good with technical assistance and getting money out the door to help small communities on wastewater. So it made sense to do it, but it takes some funding. I mean, you could try and get enough funding to be able to do technical assistance for mid-sized communities, because they can get left a little bit in the lurch, which I suspect is a bit of the origin of the question. But again, banding together with others not only gives you that economy of scale, but it also allows you to look at a watershed scale about what the smartest projects may be. Because again, as some places have groundwater, some people have surface water. So you can make the whole greater than the sum of the parts by toggling back and forth depending on who has water at a given time, and allowing people to use your storage. All those things, working at a watershed level or sub-watershed level as a whole, is going to get you a lot further faster. Again, what I just said may all be completely obvious, but that's what I've seen time after time.
So I'd like to ask you two questions. I want to combine them. One is from Ralph Proper, one of our environmental NGO community members in the Sacramento region. And one from Molly Bruce. So I'm going to read both of them off, but I was wondering if you could give your thoughts on both of them. Recharge in paleo valleys. How to accomplish this, as in ancient American River Valley. And he notes here that is slated for housing development in near Folsom.
Yep.
Molly Bruce has a question. How can we move more quickly toward a system of management and administrative law that supports MAR using flood flows? The science is unfolding nicely, but it seems like the law hasn't caught up. And I was wondering if you could give your thoughts on both those questions.
Oh, those are both great questions. I love the Paleo Valley stuff because I think it's cool. Graham Fogg's been following this for a long time at UC Davis, and then Erica Geese wrote about it, I think, in National Geographic originally, and she just did an op-ed in the New York Times, and she wrote this great book called Water Always Wins. And she's become a friend. I met her on a hike, oddly enough. But it's incredible that we have these paleo valleys, but that's part of what these DWR flyovers are going to be looking for. So again, I may be stating the obvious. The trick is to find them. And that's not just like it's right there, right, as a V, or everything would fall in. But, you're trying to find those best spots where you can get water into these places and you can get it out. You have to kind of figure that out, right? Because it goes in and then it moves all over the place. So getting it out may be a totally different place than where you put it in. It's kind of those of you who had ant farms as a kid if you could imagine, that at massive scale with more dimensions than just the narrow thing, it's very complicated under there, but it's not unmappable or unknowable. So that's one of the most exciting developments. This point that you raised that's very important about protecting the land, because there's housing development slated for it, I think is sort of our next. It's actually probably this would be a good part of my paper on state policies on land use and water. We're going to have to make some decisions about that. And to say that you can't, there are some places that are just going to have to be protected for a variety of reasons, and that's gonna be tough, because if we take away all economic value from a developer, then you will have to pay for it. If you, I mean, now I'm giving you a takings law lecture, but if there's still economic benefit, it won't be a takings. And so I think there's a way to weave it together. In part, the requirements for stormwater capture on your property that are in some stormwater permits and in some communities now for pollution reduction reasons also can work for recharge reasons. And you can design projects so they retain all their water on site and get in the ground. And I think that's the other option, is you're going to end up with more regulation to protect the ability to recharge, or, you know, people pay into regional projects that can do the same thing. Maybe there's, you know, a place that's even better to get stuff into the ground, but we're gonna have to make some of those tough choices. I mean, the Delta plan has some elements of this. They may have revised it since I was on the Delta Council, but, you know, we were taking baby steps here to say, whoa, there's a lot of stuff we're gonna need to do in the Delta, including restoration. And we have a flood issue. And so developments in the Delta, the main Delta zone, are not going to be consistent with the plan if you're going to put people in harm's way, or you're going to destroy the ability to do the restoration work that we're going to need to do over the next 30 years. I mean, it was a baby step, and maybe not perfect, but I do think this is an arena that if we're thinking long-term, we're thinking about future generations, we're going to need to do it. We're going to need to do it for floodplain setbacks. And people have done this in other countries, like the Netherlands, which is known for building dikes, right? The Netherlands did this whole room for the River Vaal, where they actually moved lots of people out of an urban floodplain because they needed it for flood control. And now they have this massive green space, and they figured out how to do that. So someday we'll have to do that kind of stuff. And the sooner we start, the better. How much the issue on the administrative side versus the technical side in managed aquifer recharge is a little complicated. I didn't read it because it just came through that it was on the website for, I don't know if it was on the water board website or it was on the governor's website about, you know, the most recent agreement between the water board and DWR rolling things out. I mean, they've been doing a lot of emergency permits because you've got, you know, people are now arguing over wet weather flows that they didn't worry about, which if you take our water rights program, you know, to its logical conclusion, you've got to get permits for all of this. And so what we're seeing people fight over it. So I think they're trying to get emergency permits out where there's no conflict. Where they have a problem is where there's conflict. And then because now everybody is eyeing flood flows, either because they've always taken those flood flows, but they never registered them as a water right, or they see, you know, there are massive fights over these flood flows too. And those become a little more difficult because the water board's got to resolve them in a very public forum. It takes a lot of time, and they don't have anywhere near the staff needed to implement the water rights system. And so it's going to take both creative permitting, which I think they've been trying to do, and more staff.
Right. This sounds like an opportunity for the water community and actually the state board to have a dialogue on how we might be able to improve those types of things, and take advantage of these flows that are being generated from these atmospheric rivers that are rolling through. Felicia, there's a question here from I apologize if I get your name right, Beth Salomone. And this looks like it's in the vein of a human right to water question. So I'm going to read it off. It's a little bit of a long question. Hi, Felicia. Beth here from the Russian River watershed. Great to see you. This watershed is an excellent example of the need for a diversified portfolio of responses to dramatic climate changes. Do you have thoughts about when regulation and funding will adapt to provide the desperately needed support, especially for disadvantaged and underrepresented communities? In the meantime, water leaders are working to educate public and elected officials on the need to take responsibility and self-advocate. Any words of the wise?
Well, again, I'm a big fan of Beth's because she was a real leader in taking the water board up on their offer during their curtailment period where it was so tough, particularly up in her watershed, to come up with an agreement at the local level. So she, we need more Beths out there who are willing to take that step and the hard work and time it takes to bring your colleagues along, let alone just figuring out, what you might want to do. The state's put out billions of dollars for small disadvantaged communities, underrepresented, for drinking water, which is obviously your first and foremost concern. And they've got a long way to go, but they've actually made an incredible amount of progress, even in the time I've been gone. I mean, we set it up, but they've been actually doing a lot there. I do think it fits into this bucket that it would be great to have more money for the planning and the work. I mean, the program, what we do have that has promise, but needs, I think, some updating I think Kamyar was going to be on this call and he would probably have the best idea. So I'd follow up with him afterwards, is to make the integrated regional watershed planning process even more robust. So you have a framework there, which was devised when the first bond issue passed, to dangle money out there for regions, getting back to that earlier question, to get together to try and figure out how to do these things together, with the promise of, you have these plans, you can get this money. And I think in some cases that's been great because it's gotten people to know each other that didn't before, because of the promise of getting money. In other places, some people have thrown their weight around and are better able to capture that money than the smaller communities, in the ag communities and others. So it's a mixed bag, but with more money for technical assistance, even some of the things that the earlier question went to, I think you could really do more. And we just need to figure out how to have a more ongoing program to help people do what they need to do to make the transitions they need to make, rather than it coming in these jolts of money that are a little less predictable.
Yes. Felicia, there are two questions.
One other,
Yeah, go ahead.
as you know well, from the Regional Water Authority, it takes a lot of money and people, and you got to have the right people to do collaborative work. That's why I'm such a fan of Beth's and the other people who rise above the talking point wars. It's very hard to do. It takes a lot of time, takes more meetings than people ever feel they have time for. And it takes some courage to rise above the pack and be willing to give something up in order to get a gain for the whole. And there are great stories all across California where people have done that. And there are way too few of them because there's so much momentum behind the distraction and blame game, which is a political overlay that happens, but it gets in the way of us coming up with logical solutions. Instead, having sat at the water board and having sat at Public Works and having sat at EPA and done hearings for years, there's this real distinction between people who come to speak and they just want to throw stones as if they're performing for the cameras, and they feel sanctimonious and right, no matter what stakeholder group they're in, by spouting what's in the interest of their stakeholders and assuming or acting as if anyone who disagrees with them was either venal or stupid. That is such a waste of time. I always do my whole speech on the challenge of ecosystem management being a much bigger problem for us than ecosystem management. It's just, you have to make a choice in life, whether you're going to reach across divides and look at the legitimate interests of everyone and try and figure out how everybody can get better together, or you're going to be the king of your own little story, which is really easy for people to do. I don't mean to be therapeutic about it, but we can all be the heroes of our own story. The challenge in having a rewarding life is to be able to be empathetic and see other people's problems and come up with solutions that get you what you need, but also get them what they need. And it's a real patchwork. So there's a certain amount of volition involved, and leadership training and supporting the convening function is the most valuable money there is.
I think so. And I'd like to remark on that a little bit. Often the source of this is conflict, and we need to move from conflict to resolution on these things. You brought up SAPA earlier, and that was born out of conflict. But even in my region, in the American River, there was enormous conflict until the water forum process started to take place, and it helped to resolve that conflict. You got people to move together and moved oppositions and rhetoric into solutions. And I'd like to say that the Regional Water Authority was born out of the Water Forum experience. It truly was. And that was an organization that helps to bring people together. It's a forum to address these types of things. So I really appreciate that comment. And we do have to move from that to working together. And there are examples of that in California, but I also agree there aren't enough. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love the work. I mean, I talked about the North U before as partnership, and, Willie Whittlesey is just one of my heroes for just seeing the value of being part of that larger consortium. Andy Fecco, Placer County's also done some great work. I couldn't profile two California examples, so I went with Yuba, but you could have done it for Placer County Water Agency as well. And then there's this whole effort that has been really fun to watch, the whole Ridgetops to Rivermouth work that has all sorts of pieces in it to try and figure out how to get more woody debris where you need it for salmon spawning, and do a bunch of those different projects that are helpful to help salmon in particular survive. The rice industry's work, the Rice Commission and rice farmers work with Caltrout and others on trying to figure out how to use rice farms, not just to help birds, but to help fish, is something I'm very excited about and trying to feature at this big Nebraska agricultural conference that's happening later this year. There's a lot of cool stuff. That's where I get, enthusiastic about the potential. Delivering on it ends up being difficult, and getting people to believe in it ends up being difficult, but it's all very inspiring work.
So while we're on that topic of woody material, I also agree that Andy Fecco and Woody Wilsley are leaders in this, in the water world, and have put a lot of good ideas forward. I understand that you are a beaver believer.
Oh yeah.
Why are beavers so important and so cool when it comes to adapting to climate change?
Well, what's funny, when I got asked to do this project on the nature-based, well, none of these projects were my idea, on nature-based, the synergy between state climate policy and nature-based solutions. It was interesting because, people were looking at, they saw all this money, particularly in California, for cap and trade, billions, including going into forest management, a lot into meadow restoration, which I give Chuck Bonham a lot of credit for pushing in both administrations, and going into ag land. And they thought, wow, there's a bonanza there potentially. Now, California money is not going to go help somebody in the upper Colorado. It's pretty arid and it's pretty limited what you can do. Offsets are actually more limited than the media space they occupy, in part because of the political challenge there. But cap and trade, which is, all in California, is pretty darn huge. But they also said, while you're at it, be sure to look at beavers. And I was like, yeah, right. Okay, beavers. And then I went and I did the research. I started looking into it. I was like, yeah, beavers. I mean, it's incredible. And there's this entire, I won't even call it a subculture. There's researchers all over the West and all over the world. There's the Sierra Meadow Partnership is this incredible collaboration of groups across the Sierras, and they're doing a lot of scientific research on both climate sequestration and water benefits of restoration. And not all restorations are alike, but what almost everybody can agree on is that beavers are actually really pretty cool. And that because they go and they're called nature's engineers, you let them go and they just build these dams. Now, the value of the dams is that you're slowing the flow, right? And you're creating marshy areas, you're creating natural fire breaks, refugia for other critters, and you're slowing the flow for later release, which is one of these miraculous things that just happens. But some states are better at beavers than others. And California had, we're like airlift. There's this great cartoon I used that a lot of people have used that I got from Occidental Arts and Ecology, which is an amazing center that in Occidental California that's been doing a lot on beaver work. They have some of the great experts there, and Brock Dolman and Kate Lundquist. But we used to parachute them, not in little parachutes strapped to them like the cartoon, but in cages that then would open on the ground to do restoration and to get them away from where they can be a nuisance and either, cutting down the wrong trees or in flooding farmers' fields. But in like 1950, Fish and Game passed a resolution that sort of classified them as a pest or a predator. And it's illegal to translocate a beaver in California now, although that's going to change because in the last budget, Governor Newsom, who clearly is a beaver believer too, put $5 million in to hire staff to redevelop a better program. And again, I give Chuck a lot of credit for it, but I also give the governor a lot of credit for it. And there's just amazing stories. Once you're in this network, you hear about the stuff is funny. Like there's a documentary called Beaver Believers. There's a book called Eager, The Amazing Story of Beavers by Ben Goldfarb, who's a really nice guy. There's this amazing telegenic and brilliant professor down at the Cal State Channel Islands named Emily Fairfax, who's just a hoot to watch on Twitter and elsewhere. And she wrote a whole thing called Smokey the Beaver. And she's been doing all this research on the creating of the natural fire breaks. And then it turned out, even after I wrote my paper, which featured beavers, there's a guy at Stanford who is doing a project, Scott Fendorf, that just came out that talks about beaver complexes as a real hedge against climate change. And there's a story that came out, I'll stop. There's a story that came out recently even about in the Ukraine, where the beavers are heroes in some areas because they've created all this slowing the flow with their dens and their dams. They call it something other than dams, I can't remember. And that's created this marshy area, which is making it really hard for Russian troops to advance in certain areas. So they become little war heroes. I mean, it's actually, there's more, and there's a beaver summit that happens periodically. There are urban beavers like Martinez beavers. I mean, there's a whole subculture here and it's just fun. People also have a sense of humor, which you really need in this work.
This is interesting. So you have converted me into a beaver believer and beaver believer. So Felicia, we're coming to the close of the session. I really appreciate it. There are a number of questions that we've received, but we're not going to be able to get to today. I think you expressed some interest in maybe corresponding with the questioners and getting back to them.
Yeah, the ones I can answer easily, I'm happy to. Yeah.
Okay. And then I was hoping that you'd be able to close the session with some thoughts that you want to share, some wisdom going forward, and be curious to hear your closing thoughts.
Well, that's kind of you. Thank you for the opportunity to express myself. I think I've done a lot of it, but I think, it's a time of promise and peril. But I really think that it's not the there's technology that's out there to help us, data and transparency, all that stuff that can help public policy move, but we need to move on a lot of these things rather than being stuck in stasis, whether it's in the Delta or the Colorado or wherever we are. And I do think, as I said, that the key issue, and this is a broken record for me over the past 30 something years, is us and how we interact with each other and how we, the millennials talk about it as othering people in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's true everywhere. I think that we have to bring more empathy and compassion to this work for the legitimate concerns of others and work on mutual problem solving. And where you find a collection of people that do, things happen. And I would argue that the only time things happen is when you have that right collection of people. I've been lucky enough to have experienced that a few times in my life. So it makes me more of a glass half full. There's an opportunity here person than cynical and depressed, which it's easy to be because then you go into anger, which politicians and political consultants and everybody, even more so on social media drives you to. But if you can find those connections and find those people and find it within yourself to be constructive in every setting. My experience in my life has been extraordinary what you can do. We didn't talk as much about my LA history, but Heal the Bay was able to, with its other colleagues in the environmental world, and the fact that we would work with our other colleagues in the environmental world was somewhat unusual, but we also invited people in government or the business sector in to work with us and be part of the vision. And so it's a much more collaborative community even to this day than any place else I've ever been. And we were able to take over City Hall and the city and, work, internationally recognized turnarounds and improvements in LA. It's partially why I love LA so much, because even though it's big, honestly, the wannabes go to Hollywood. And so the people who are in the civic culture in LA are people who care about civic culture a little more than about their own status. And it's big, right? So you can really influence a big swath. But the key to the environmental community we rebuilt is that we invited other people in. We used compassion, and we would say yay and yes when people, met us part way. And then they always wanted to go further because it was way more fun to work with us. So I do think that human dimension becomes very important. And I think people either think it's a Hallmark card and touchy-feely or soft, when in fact it's the only thing that makes a difference. I could tell you stories about the Bay Delta Accord in the 90s and put names on the people who were brave, courageous, or creative enough to be able to come up with solutions that would help more than just their particular entity. So it really does take that. It takes folks in government being tough sometimes too. You got to be willing to be the 800-pound gorilla and be decisive. It's not all, Pollyanna and Donna Reed. You have to mix strength with compassion in order to get stuff to happen.
Felicia, I really appreciate you joining us today for Coffee and Conversation. This was really great today. I've got some takeaways. I love LA. What you said earlier has, well, I'm just going to say that now I have the Randy Newman song playing in my head.
Yeah.
But a takeaway, you've provided a lot of insight today. A takeaway is collaboration, creativity, working together, which I think we all need to do. Again, there were a lot of questions that were asked. We never got to this. There were questions on sites and reservoir, but we ran out of time, and I'm hoping that you might be able to correspond with the folks that asked those questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. And that's it for Coffee and Conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.